Despite what is widely taught in American schools, the War of 1812 was far from a British defeat. But, in all fairness, it certainly wasn't the glorious triumph that so many Britons expected it would be either. On numerous occasions, they suffered rather shocking defeats at the hands of the young American Republic. And for many British soldiers, just coming out of the far more cataclysmic and harrowing Napoleonic Wars, this was a genuine surprise. It was commonly thought that after peace had been declared in Europe and an expeditionary force, which included many of the hardened Peninsular War veterans, was sent out, that the British would be able to end the war with America rather decisively and exact on them whatever terms they pleased. Instead, while initial success was met at the Battle of Bladensburg and the burning of Washington, the expedition largely foundered, and we all know the story of that most shameful defeat at New Orleans, which, while largely downplayed after the war, represented to the British at that time one of the most significant objectives of the entire conflict. As you may imagine, after the war, many Britons found themselves asking, how could this have happened? And what could they have done differently to actually win the war instead of just fighting to a bloody stalemate? Well, in his book, A Narrative on the Campaigns of the British Army at Washington and New Orleans, George Robert Gleig, a British officer who, as a Peninsular War veteran, served in that expeditionary force, offers his own take on these questions. In Gleig's narrative, it's common at the end of any campaign for him to offer commendations on those actions which were performed admirably, and criticism for those which went poorly, alongside his own opinion on how things ought to have been done. After he discusses the disastrous campaign fought by the British in Louisiana, which, incidentally, he attributes those failures more to mismanagement and outright bad luck for the British than to American skill outright, well, Gleig turns his attention to the wider war. First, he discusses the failings of the British in the conflict, who again, even if they technically came to the treaty table as equals and not as a conquered party, were still quite humbled. And then he moves on to how the British ought to have fought the war, how they could have had that triumph which they so eagerly expected. The result of this is a fascinating look at what might have happened had the British dedicated themselves more fully to the war than they did, and had they estimated more accurately the martial abilities of the young American nation. And so with that, I leave you with the writings of George Robert Gleig. The fact is that when we look back upon the whole series of events produced by the late American War, we shall find little that is likely to flatter our vanity or increase our self-importance. Except a few successes in Canada at its very commencement and the brilliant inroad upon Washington, it will be found that our arms have been constantly baffled or repulsed on shore, while at sea, with the exception of the capture of the Chesapeake and one or two other affairs towards its conclusions, we have been equally unsuccessful. From what cause does this proceed? Not from any inferiority in courage or discipline, because in these particulars British soldiers and sailors will yield to none in the world. There must, then, be some other cause for these misfortunes, and the cause is surely one which has continually baffled all our plans of American warfare. We have long been habituated to despise the Americans as an enemy unworthy of serious regard. To this alone it is to be attributed that frigates half-manned were sent out to cope with ships capable of containing them within their hulls. And to this also, the trifling handfuls of troops dispatched to conduct the war by land. Instead of 1,500, had 10,000 men sailed from the Garonne under General Ross, how differently might he have acted? There would have been no necessity for a re-embarkation, consequently no time given for the defense of Baltimore, but marching across the country, he might have done to the one city what he did to the other. And it is thus only that a war with America can be successfully carried on. To penetrate up the country amidst pathless forests and boundless deserts, and to aim at permanent conquest, is out of the question. America must be assaulted only on her coasts. Her harbors destroyed, her shipping burned, and her seaport towns laid waste are the only evils which she has reason to dread. And were a sufficient force embarked with these orders, no American war would be of long continuance. A melancholy experience has now taught us that such a war must not be entered into unless it be conducted with spirit. And there is no conducting it with spirit except with a sufficient numerical force. To the plan which I propose of making desert the whole line of coast, it may be objected that by doing so we should distress individuals, and not the government. But they who offer this objection forget the nature both of the people whose cause they plead, and of the government under which they live. In a democratical government, the voice of the people must at all times prevail. The very members of the House of Representatives are the persons who, from such proceedings, would suffer most severely, and we all know how far private suffering goes to influence a man's public opinions. Besides, the very principle upon which the advocates for the sacredness of private property proceed is altogether erroneous. I admit that in absolute monarchies, where war is more properly the pastime of kings than the desire of subjects, non-combatants ought to be dealt with as humanely as possible. Not so, however, in states governed by popular assemblies. By compelling the constituents to experience the real hardships and miseries of warfare, you will soon compel the representatives to a vote of peace. And surely that line of conduct is, upon the whole, most humane, which puts the speediest period to the cruelties of war. There are few men who would not rather endure a raging fever for 3 days than a slow and lingering disease for 3 months. So it is with a democracy at war. Burn their houses, plunder their property, block up their harbors, and destroy their shipping in a few places. And before you have time to proceed to the rest, you will be stopped by entreaties for peace. Whereas if you do no mischief that can be avoided, if you only fight their fleets and armies wherever you meet them, and suffer the inhabitants to live in undisturbed tranquility, they will continue these hostilities till they have worn out the means of one party and greatly weakened those of both. Should another war break out between Great Britain and America, this is the course to be adopted by the former. Besides this, I humbly conceive that a second attempt should be made upon New Orleans, since the importance of the conquest would authorize any sacrifice for its attainment, and when once gained, it could be easily defended. The neck of land upon which that city is built extends in the same manner above it as below, and therefore the same advantages which it holds out to its present defenders, it would likewise hold out to us. A chain of works thrown across from the river to the marsh would render it inaccessible from above, while, by covering the lakes and the Mississippi with cruisers, all attack from below would be sufficiently guarded against. With those words of warning and a final plan laid out to effectively crush the United States, should war ever break out between the two nations again, Gleig ends his narrative. Most interestingly, he does so with one final note that the British ought again try to conquer New Orleans as a primary objective. No doubt this is, at least in part, due to Gleig's horrific experiences at the tragedy that was the Battle of New Orleans for the British Empire. Of course, hindsight always is 20/20, and in matters of military history, it is nigh on always said that, oh, if only things had been done this way, we could have won, that there was always another path that could have been taken, and which would have resulted in a glorious triumph, where, in reality, only shame was met. All the same, I do believe that there is some truth in Gleig's words, and that had the war been waged in the fashion that he describes, well, the results certainly would have been very different, although I also can't help but feel that such a brutal conflict against a civilian population would have only inspired greater American hatred in the long run as well. And of course, whether the British public would have ever stood for such a protracted war of attrition, especially after their experiences in Europe, is doubtful at best. So what do all of you think? Do you find wisdom in Gleig's words, or optimism, or a dark sense of anger and desire for revenge, even? Could the British Empire have met with an absolute victory and crushed the United States in the War of 1812? Or would other factors allow the American Republic to weather Gleig's strategy and still win for themselves an equal place at the peace talks? By all means, do let me know your thoughts in the comments section, because this is a very interesting piece. And if this video was interesting to you, do be sure to also watch the other one where I read another piece from Gleig's narrative, which, in relation to what Gleig is promoting the British do to the American public in this bit, well, it makes it rather interesting. You should see that video popping up on your screen here fairly shortly. You may also, if you are so inclined, find a link to the full account in the description below. Otherwise, a hearty thank you to all for watching, and particularly to those most gracious individuals who support me on Patreon and thus allow me to continue making these videos. Until I should next appear before you, my dear viewer, I am, and I shall remain, your most humble and obedient of servants.